Good evening and welcome to this evening's event, a town hall meeting for the 5 towns and for Rockaway community to discuss the COVID vaccine and some other questions that people have on the topic. We are grateful for our panels of experts and our rabbinic participants, but I'd like to start by also thanking the sponsors that brought this event to the community. Most of the doctors on our panel tonight are members of and participate with the Jewish Orthodox Women Association, and we are grateful for their bringing information to the from community. The event is co-sponsored by the Bikur Cholim, the JCCRP, and Hatzalah to, again, bring information to the community and make informed decisions on the topic. I think we'll jump right in and get started. Obviously, coming from a Torah perspective is a good way for a community like this to start. We're grateful for Rabbi Flum to be here. Rabbi Flum is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Torah Studies Network. He's the Mishkiach Ruchani at the Lander College for Women, and he is an expert in the Torah-based biomedical ethics. And we are grateful. Rabbi Flum, if you can give us an introduction to the event. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. I would just like to give a very quick introduction to the halachic perspective of the importance of medicine and what are the halachic parameters defining how we're supposed to deal with medical issues. The first thing I want to mention in the world of halacha based upon biblical law and Talmudic law is the Torah says, the Torah tells us there is an obligation for a person to be involved in medical care. According to all the sources, this halacha is number one, obligatory. Number two, it applies not only to a doctor practicing medicine to cure patients, but it's likewise an equal obligation upon a patient who feels they're sick to go and search and seek the proper specialists out there to treat the illness they possess. So there's an obligation on the doctor, there's an obligation on the patient. This concept of responsibility to practice medicine and to receive medical care is not only dealing with the concept of curing disease, but even preventing disease. And this is the way the Gedolei HaPoskim of our 21st century paskin. We have to do whatever we can to make sure not only that we cure disease that we might have, but prevent disease we might have by the modern medicine available to us in the marketplace. I do want to mention that there is a Torah obligation to listen to the doctors of a historical period of time, to hear what medicine has to say about the medical treatments that are available when it comes to taking care of medical problems. I also want to mention that the medicines that are used have to be approved. They have to be what's called in halacha refuah beduka, for instance, FDA approved, which means they have been tested, tried, and proven to be sufficient to take care of treating disease or preventing disease. And I also want to mention a very important fact many people are not aware of. Chazal, who are themselves, many of them doctors themselves in their generations, were aware of the fact that not every medicine cures everybody on an equal level. Some people are cured, some people are not cured. Sometimes a minimum amount of people might be injured, but by and large, the medicines that we use or have used in the past and surely presently usually are, when it comes to statistics, successful in the majority of cases in which they are administered. I do want to mention there's no such thing as 100% safe medicine. Chazal already told us the reason that the Gemara uses the expression, God gave us a reshus, a permission to practice medicine, is the awareness that any time the doctor gives you a prescription, a medicine to take, or they perform a surgical procedure, there's always a certain amount of risk involved in this procedure. Nevertheless, God gave us a divine sanction, not only to practice medicine, but to sometimes momentarily place our patients in momentary danger more than they were before for the purpose of treating them and curing them from illness or preventing them from receiving disease. So to say the medicine is only 100% we are supposed to take, and medicine that's not 100% is halachically and historically inaccurate. Medicine itself usually cures people if it's approved, but there are always exceptions to the rule. That still does not exempt anybody from using medicine if that's the way people are curing disease or preventing disease in their generation. I want to just end off with a little story over here to put in perspective how important this is. Many, many years ago, when the terrible polio disease was striking the public. But obviously, people were a little nervous to undergo a polio vaccine. And, there were many people who were talking about, should we not? Is there a danger involved? And at that time, one of the great rabbinical sages of that period of time, his name is Rav Aaron Kotler Zechatzal Levracha, the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood Yeshiva, said to the medical world, I want to teach my people a halachic concept. Publicly, he rolled up his sleeves and he said to the Jewish Torah community, I want to be the first person to receive this polio vaccine in order to demonstrate the halachic obligation we have not only to cure disease, but likewise to prevent disease. And I hope they understand that what I'm doing is a halacha lamasa, a halachic responsibility that the patient has for themselves and a halachic obligation the doctor has in helping people prevent from getting themselves sick. We have tonight three distinguished doctors in three different disciplines that deal with patients on a continual ongoing basis. Each one has expertise in areas that relate to the specific vaccine of the COVID-19 we're going to be discussing this evening. All of them have incredible medical knowledge and experience in the field. I'm not going to speak for them, but one thing I will mention, that you have an incredible group of doctors here tonight that will serve as an incredible repository of medical knowledge. If during the course of the evening you have any other halachic questions you might have, I'm going to be here to answer those questions as well. But without any further ado, I want to hand the program back to Mr. Malinsky for her to introduce our doctors, distinguished doctors who will be addressing us this evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Flaum. An interesting anecdote. We're going to have our panelists do a short presentation sharing their expertise, and we'll leave the question and answer portion to the event after that. We'll start by asking Dr. Oppenheim to present. Dr. Oppenheim received his medical degree from the Yale University School of Medicine, after which he completed residency in internal medicine at the New York Weill Cornell Medical Center and a fellowship in infectious disease at the Montefiore Medical Center, Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He is currently an attending physician in infectious disease at North Shore University Hospital and an assistant professor in medicine at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. In addition, he serves as vice president and chief medical information officer for Northwell Health. In that role, he was heavily involved in the data analytic aspect of the health system's emergency response to the COVID pandemic. We are grateful for his time and his expertise here. Dr. Oppenheim?
Thank you for that introduction, Ms. Malinsky and Bishop Rabbi Flaum. I'd like to start off by giving a little background on the vaccine science. I think everyone's aware from everything you've read and heard that the currently available vaccines are using what is perceived by some to be a relatively new vaccine technology, most notably mRNA or DNA vector, viral vector DNA vaccines. And what I think is perhaps not as well known is that these scientific platforms for development of vaccines using this mRNA or virus DNA vector technology has actually been experimented with for more than 10 years for a variety of diseases. As a matter of fact, many pharmaceutical houses are looking to convert their current vaccines to using this technology. For a bunch of reasons that I'll talk about, it was decided to use this technology as the first one for COVID for some advantages that I'll talk about in a moment, but also because it takes a significant amount of financial investment to bring these vaccines to market at scale. And so for other viruses for which vaccines were available, the investment wasn't as worthwhile, whereas for this, where there was no competing vaccine, it made a lot of sense to make the investment and produce these at scale. Now, the reason that this vaccine technique is so attractive is because it most naturally artificially mimics what happens with a natural infection, and therefore the immunity that it stimulates is also much more robust, we believe, than other traditional types of vaccinations. The thing you need to understand is that viruses are not free-living creatures the way bacteria are. In order for them to replicate and continue their life cycle, they actually have to take over the cells of whatever animal or person they're infecting. We'll talk about humans tonight. So when you get a cold virus or the flu virus or conjunctivitis or any viral infection, those viruses carry the DNA to make more virus, but they don't carry any of the materials to actually use that DNA to make virus. They invade your cells and they take over your cellular machinery to manufacture more of themselves. So the mRNA virus that delivers a little piece of a virus, not a whole virus, right? So what it delivers into your cells cannot make more virus, but it teaches your cells to make enough of the virus for your immune system to learn to act against it. Is very similar to what your body does when you get a natural viral infection. And that seems to stimulate, you probably heard a lot in the news about antibodies and T cells, and there are different arms of the immune system. And when your own body cell is invaded and starts to produce something that is not part of your body normally, it activates all the different arms of the immune system. And so it produces a very robust immune response. And so that is why this technique of introducing a little piece of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID, into your cells, not enough to make more COVID. Your body cannot manufacture virus from this, just a little protein, enough though that all arms of your immune system learn to attack it should it come into your body again. And that's why these vaccines have such high efficacy rates, as we'll talk about in a moment, and why, again, as you're seeing the emerging literature, why it seems to cause antibody responses, T cell responses, and memory immunity in different parts of your body. It really seems to very effectively stimulate the immune system by virtue of mimicking what a viral infection does without putting you at risk for any sort of virus infection, because there's just not enough pieces to make a virus, just to make enough for your body to learn to recognize it. Now, Rabbi Flum introduced the concept of refuah b'duka, right? And I think one of the other questions we get asked is, what exactly is this emergency use authorization as opposed to a full FDA approval? And does that mean that the FDA had a lower set of standards and was willing to accept products that were less safe or less proven? And I would argue the answer is not really. The things that were allowed in order to receive an emergency use authorization as opposed to a full authorization was a couple of things. Vaccines go through, or any biologic or pharmaceutical, goes through 3 stages of testing: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, where phase 3 is the ultimate clinical trial to see does it protect against disease, and the earlier other ones are scientific to see how your body reacts to it, what the right dose is. And normally there are breaks between phases 1, 2, and 3. Under the emergency use authorization, the pharmaceutical houses were allowed to move straight from 1 and 2 that were done simultaneously and into 3, which again doesn't impact any of the safety and efficacy evaluation. The normal protocol for a FDA approval of a biologic is 6 months of use for efficacy to be proven. In the case of the emergency use authorization, what they said was, when the pharmaceutical test reaches the point at which you've seen enough cases in your placebo group, the group that didn't receive the vaccine, versus those who did receive the vaccine, to make a statistically valid case that the vaccine is effective, you could stop before 6 months if that occurred, which was, again, how these made it to the market a little bit quicker. I will point out that now well more than 6 months have passed since this vaccine is being used. So the standard of 6 months has been well exceeded in what's called the post-marketing experience, where the vaccine is watched after it's administered. But prior to the approval, and the reason it was an emergency use was because they terminated most of them at 3 or 4 months because they had enough data to show that it was effective. There was a little bit of a different review panel, whereas normally there's a couple of months of different bodies reviewing it. Here, they convened a single 120-person independent advisory panel across multiple disciplines in healthcare to review the virus, to the vaccine efficacy. So that accelerated things a little bit. And the other thing, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, is it required that there be more aggressive post-marketing surveillance, right? So since they knew that it was a little bit shorter of a trial by maybe 2 or 3 months, there was going to be more post-marketing surveillance around this. And I'll talk about that in a moment, and maybe we'll talk about it more in the question and answer. There was absolutely no compromise of the safety requirements. Every potential adverse event with the vaccine had to be reported the way it is with every other vaccine trial. As a matter of fact, just anecdotally, to show how aggressive they were in saying everything had to be reported, and I believe it was the Pfizer trial, maybe the Moderna trial, but I think in the Pfizer trial, there was a report of a case of multiple facial bruises and fractures as a result of blunt force trauma with another individual's hand. So basically, someone reported that someone got punched in the face after receiving the vaccine. But because something happened that was adverse after the vaccine, it gets reported. And not surprisingly, the review board determined that it was unlikely to be vaccine related. But I share that anecdote only to show you how the safety surveillance for vaccine-induced issues was not relaxed an iota just because it was an emergency use authorization. I think everyone is probably familiar with the clinical trial results and the very, very high efficacy with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines showing, in the mid 90, well over 90% efficacy at preventing disease. J&J maybe slightly less than that, but overall, very, very significant number. Maybe it's, more like 72 or 75% for J&J. There are some caveats. We know that older adults may mount a slightly less effective response. And we certainly know that patients with severe immunosuppression, so potentially cancer patients, the one that has the most data is organ transplant patients, where there were not enough of these patients in the trials to make a lot of statement, but in the post-marketing era, now that they're doing trials, there's definitely lower antibody production in organ transplant recipients. And so there are still vulnerable populations. And I think the key thing to keep in mind is that no vaccine, as Roy Flaum alluded to, is 100%. 90%, 95% is far better than flu shots, far better than many vaccines on the market, but there are breakthrough cases. In the trials, the good news is that in the trials, even when there were breakthrough cases, almost no, minimal cases of folks who actually required hospitalizations or had severe disease. So even in the cases where there were vaccine breakthroughs, and we've seen this in our experience, post-marketing, almost everybody who gets it who's had the vaccine has a mild case, and hospitalization is exceedingly rare in vaccinated people. But because there are vulnerable populations, it is imperative, I think, on all of us to consider the fact that we have a communal obligation to protect those for whom the vaccine is less effective. And so the need for everybody who is healthy and maybe not as high risk to have a bad outcome, there is a need for them to stay healthy and keep this from circulating to the extent possible, because there are still small numbers of patients with some vulnerability. I want to talk in my last few moments about the concept of variants. I think you've all heard on the news about the circulating virus variants. In general, most of the variants that are out there affect infectivity, I mean how easily the virus is transmitted from person to person. They seem to have, for the most part, most of the variants have less effect or no effect on making the vaccine less effective. There is one known mutation in some countries, and that mutation is present in the New York City area as well, happens to be called 484K for those who follow this sort of nerdy thing like I do. This mutation does seem to make the virus slightly less effective. We don't have a lot of data on how Moderna and Pfizer will fare in large-scale trials against that mutation, because it was not very predominant at the time the Moderna and Pfizer trials were carried out. In the laboratory, it appears the impact on efficacy is very mild. It makes the antibodies in your blood work slightly less, unlikely to be to the event that to the level that it affects the vaccine's ability to protect you. The J&J vaccine is a little bit less effective against that E484K mutation. So in the J&J trials, the South African arm of the trial did show a lower efficacy, but again, not a tremendous amount lower. And so the reason you hear a lot from the scientific community about the concern about variants is not because these variants that are out now are particularly dangerous. However, mutations in viruses is a random ongoing event. 1 in every N million viral replications will lead to a genetic change. And so the concern is getting viral replication in the community down to the point where the number of viruses replicating are so low that we are not going to continue to evolve these mutations to the point where the vaccines become less effective. So the point of understanding the variants is to say, the less people that are transmitting this virus, the less time the virus is replicating, the less chance of a random mutation occurring and making the virus even less susceptible in the future. So the take home is the vaccines work against the mutations, but if we stop transmission, we prevent development of future mutations. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oppenheim. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dienstag. Dr. Dienstag practiced pediatrics in the Five Towns area of Long Island. She was formerly the director of pediatrics at St. John's Episcopal Hospital in Rockaway, New York, and recently served on the medical liaison committee of the Torah Academy for Girls in Rockaway and the Shalamis School for Girls in the Five Towns to advise on the school's response to the COVID epidemic. Dr. Dienstag is involved with a broad range of social, educational, and charitable organizations for which she has received numerous honors. She's a graduate of City College and received her medical degree from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. We are honored and thrilled to have her here to share her expertise with us. Thank you, Dr. Dienstag.
Hi, good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for setting up this wonderful program this evening, Rabbi Flaum for the wonderful introduction, Dr. Oppenheim for your very scientific and helpful explanations. And now the question is, why am I speaking tonight? Why did you ask me to come speak? I think the first thing I'd like to say, we have an unbelievable bracha in having a vaccine that in such a short period of time has really knocked down our numbers and made life a little bit more bearable. And what I would like to say is we now have the opportunity, perhaps a very small opportunity, a very small window to get our lives back to normal. That's what people say to me all the time. I just want life to go back to the good old days. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get you back to the good old days. And the way we're going to do that is by establishing something wonderful, which doesn't sound so nice, called herd immunity. People talk about that a lot. How do we get to herd immunity? Well, we're not a herd. We are a people that cares about one another. And I really feel this is an opportunity for us to talk about how much Jews are aravim zeh lazeh, how much we really have to do for each other. As one of my teenage patients put it so beautifully in my office, and I really would love to quote this young man. I said to him, are you going to get the vaccine? Because at that point in time, it was not yet approved for those under 18. He was a senior in high school and he was just under 18. And he said to me, of course I'm going to get the shot as soon as I can get it. And I said, why? He said, because I love my Bubby and Sadie, and I don't want to bring home anything really bad for them. And I want to be able to walk into their house and feel calm and cool that I'm not doing anything wrong by being there. So that's one of the reasons why we need to talk about this. So yes, we need to do it for an altruistic point of view because we worry about people. There was an article in the New York Times, far be it for me to be quoting the New York Times, but we will today, that said, please get the vaccine for my 4-year-old. That was the headline. And why? Because her 4-year-old apparently had a bone marrow transplant for cancer and needed to be protected. Those children are not going to be able to get the vaccine, and they're certainly not going to be able to mount an immune response. So it's incumbent upon us to do something to protect them. But what's in it for me? You know, everybody, it's a for me generation. So what's in it for me? So in the for me, we have long haulers. And even though we say young adults and children do much better than us old folks do getting this disease, we really have to realize that almost 1 out of 3 young folks have long haul symptoms. Just last week, I had a patient literally run into my office to say, the best thing just happened to me. I said, really? What's the best thing that just happened to you? She had COVID over a year ago, last Pesach, and has had no sense of taste since then. Basically, he's been eating paper for the past 14 months just to stay going, which is a very sad state. She got her first dose of Pfizer and got back her sense of taste. So we are really seeing wonderful reactions to this vaccine. So if you want to know why you need to get it, even if you've had the disease, for many people, it really is a huge refuah. The people who are tired all the time, the people who have what we call chronic fatigue syndrome, which we used to associate only with mononucleosis or Epstein-Barr virus, now seems to also, unfortunately, plague a lot of people who've had COVID-19. In addition, many people are achy. One of the teachers in TAG who I spoke to not that long ago has really been out of school the whole year. She hasn't been sick the whole year, quote unquote, but she hasn't been functional. She hasn't been able to get out and run a classroom and run a school. And those are the kinds of things that we are seeing after we vaccinate people. So that is really part of why we want to be involved. We want to vaccinate. And we want to know what we can do to prevent ourselves from getting ill. We could continue wearing those N95 masks, as has been suggested, but we would like to move past that. We want to move into normal life. And this is an opportunity for us to get back to that normal life. There are no guarantees with COVID, unfortunately. I can't say, well, if you get it when you're under 30, you don't have to worry about it. We can't make that promise. We can't make that promise to under 20s. There are people who are still having serious complications, even at a young age, and we want to be able to protect them. We also talk about the variants, and yes, the less the virus gets to replicate, the less it gets to be around, the less variants are going to come by. And some of the variants are definitely more contagious, more concerning, more difficult and to deal with. And the faster we get everybody vaccinated, the easier and the better it's going to be for all of us. We hear stories of, yeah, you know, I got the vaccine and I was so sick for 3 days. It's not pleasant. I'm not going to say it was pleasant when I had my second vaccine and I felt like I couldn't get out of bed and had shaking chills for 2 days. But it was certainly a whole lot more pleasant than having COVID, which is not going to be gone in 2 days with some Advil and a bed rest. So that's really what we're trying to emphasize. Are there possible complications to the vaccine? Of course there are. There are possible complications when you take a penicillin tablet, or when you take an Advil or a Tylenol. So we know that nothing in medicine is perfect, but this is pretty good. And I think sometimes we just say pretty good is good enough right now for all of us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dienstag. And finally, we'll move to our panelist, Dr. Altman. Dr. Altman is faculty, is a faculty attending in obstetrics and gynecology at the Long Island Jewish Hospital at Northwell Health. She is an assistant professor at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra University. She attended McGill Medical School, sits on numerous hospital committees, including the admissions committee for Hofstra Medical School. Dr. Altman has received numerous awards for teaching medical students and residents. Most recently, she received the 2020 Teaching Award from the Association of Professors of Gynecology and Obstetrics. And we are grateful to have her and her expertise here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Altman.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you to the other panelists and their perspective. I really want to thank Rabbi Flaum for giving a halachic perspective to take the vaccine. I would love him to be in my office to be able to talk to my own patients, because maybe if I can't influence them, maybe he can influence some of them. So I'm going to start with this joint statement that was put out by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Association for Reproductive Medicine, and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. These are the three big governing bodies that came out with a statement when the vaccine became available. Since the vaccine was not studied, the initial studies did not include pregnant patients, but we felt strongly that pregnant patients should still receive the vaccine. So the statement goes that throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, patients have had questions about the impact of the virus on their health. Now, as the rollout of the COVID vaccine progresses, patients similarly have questions about whether the vaccine is right for their individual health needs. As experts in reproductive health, we continue to recommend that the vaccine be available to pregnant individuals. We also assure patients that there is no evidence that the vaccine could lead to loss of fertility. While fertility was not specifically studied in the clinical trials of vaccine, no loss of fertility has been reported among trial participants or among the millions who have received the vaccine since their authorization, and no signs of infertility appeared in animal studies. Loss of fertility is scientifically unlikely. So this was put out, a statement by all the 3 major governing bodies for obstetrics and gynecology. So why do we as obstetricians really feel that even though initially, now studies are coming out of pregnant patients and research studies that are receiving the vaccine, but initially when the vaccine came out, they were not included, but we still felt that a lot of pregnant patients should receive the vaccine. And we do have a whole year of studies of the effect of COVID on pregnant patients. And a lot of the studies show that patients that are pregnant, should they contract COVID-19, they are sicker than the general population. So these are just a few statistics showing that there is certainly an increase in severity of the illness for pregnant patients versus the general population. So another thing that we found, certainly in the height of the pandemic, March, April, and May in New York, we were finding, and studies have proven this, that patients that came in with the COVID had a much higher risk of preterm delivery. And studies did show this, that the preterm birth rate increased by a ratio of 3 times more in individuals that had COVID-19 than the uninfected individuals. So the rate, one of the studies quoted a rate of 16% of preterm births versus the general population of a 6% preterm birth rate. There's another study from the UK that also showed that the rate of stillbirths was up by a 2 to 3-fold higher incidence versus patients that did not have COVID or pre-pandemic numbers. So just these statistics alone made most people feel that pregnant patients would benefit from getting the vaccine. So I don't have recent data. This data is the collection from the vSafe, which is reports every patient that gets the vaccine, and every pregnant patient, it is encouraged that they get reported. The data should be coming out within the next week or 2 because it's released every 3 months. So unfortunately, I don't have the most recent data. In terms of the numbers, I know the numbers are up to 100,000 that are registered. But for February, that we had up to 30,000. So what does this data show? So as of the end of February, I can't really comment, and I'm going to be very honest, about pregnancy complications like gestational diabetes or congenital anomalies per se, or small for gestational age, mostly because the vaccine at this stage was only out for 2-3 months. Pregnancy is 9 months. So we can't really yet comment about congenital anomalies, IUGR, because we haven't seen them. These patients haven't delivered yet. But the rate, and there has been a lot of publicity, has been about the miscarriage rate. And there's a lot of misinformation about that. The vaccine has been found to increase the rate of miscarriage in the general population. And looking at these numbers, 26 might be a little high. Usually the miscarriage rate we quote is about 20%. And according to this registry, which is 2 to 3 months in with the vaccine, the miscarriage rate was just 15%. So we definitely could comment 3-4 months into our population of getting the vaccine, and it's become very obvious that it has not affected the miscarriage. Oops, sorry. I don't know why I'm going backwards. I apologize. Sorry. Okay. So what are the advantages of getting the vaccine? So besides the fact that you're protected against getting COVID, there are also studies that are now showing that there is transplacental transfer of the antibodies from the vaccine. So if a pregnant woman gets the vaccine, they have found that there is passive immunity to the neonate as early as 16 days after the first vaccine. So as a woman gets the vaccine and then she gets the second vaccine a month later, there will be even more antibodies transferring to that neonate. So the best advantage is to try to get the vaccine, at least in second trimester or early third trimester, so that the pregnant patient will have a very high immune response to the vaccine, and that will pass on to the neonate. A little thing that we also noted is because we tend to give the Tdap vaccine in third trimester, we also have to make sure not to coincide it with the COVID vaccine. So that just needs to be worked out with your obstetrician. For us, we usually encourage everybody to get the COVID vaccine as soon as possible. And so therefore that would not interfere with them getting the Tdap, which we give in the third trimester. Another study showing the benefit of the vaccine, this came out of Israel. It included 84 women that provided 504 breast milk samples. And as you could see, the different antibodies that are produced are found in the breast milk. The IgG antibodies were positive up to almost close to 92% the 4th week after the vaccine, and 97% by the 5th and 6th week. So that definitely shows that passive immunity through breast milk to the fetus, to the neonate, is very advantageous. So we definitely would encourage most women, if they're hesitant to get the vaccine during pregnancy, definitely to get it while they are nursing. So just for the last, this is a very recent slide. I know it's very scientific. There is so much publicity that this vaccine has caused infertility, that it has caused damage or inhibits the specific protein in the placenta, causing neonates not to grow appropriately, causing fetuses not to grow appropriately. This is a study that just came out in mid-May, and it actually looked at the histology of the placenta to see if there was any difference between control groups versus groups that did get the vaccine. And what this study shows is they did not see a single difference in the pathology, the histology of the placentas of women that got the vaccine. So the key point that I really want to bring up is that it is important to consider getting the vaccine while you're pregnant, consider getting the vaccine before you even conceive. But I could understand my patients who are pregnant, and we don't have many months of data about the vaccine yet. So I can understand their hesitancy. So my plea to my pregnant patients is, I can understand you, I would like you to get the vaccine. I can understand you being hesitant not getting the vaccine, but I definitely encourage your partners, your family to get the vaccine so that they will protect you and that you would not be exposed if you choose not to get the vaccine. It is really important that your family members, your spouse, your partner gets the vaccine, not to expose you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Altman. If I can ask you to stop the screen share.
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you. So again, thank you to each of the panelists for your knowledge and expertise and clarity of information. Many of our participants tonight have submitted questions, so we'll start our question and answer part of this evening. It is a town hall, and so we did want to make sure we get to at least a majority of the questions that we may not have time to get to all. Before we get started, I just want to let participants know that we do have a phone number where we will take texted clarification questions. So again, we're not taking new questions because we have so many that came in before the event, but if there's something that was said tonight that needs some clarification, the number to text is 737-443-9868. Just one more time for your convenience, 737-443-9868. And again, those will only be taking clarifying questions. Dr. Dienstag, if you're okay, I'd like to start asking you just some questions related to children in specific. There's a question that came in. I'm actually going to combine two questions. It says, are vaccines really necessary for children under 18? And isn't COVID benign in children under 18?
So the answer to the answer to both of those questions are yes, they're really necessary, and no, this is not so benign as you think it is. I'll throw in one more that I know had been asked, was about myocarditis, or heart inflammation from the vaccine. That is being closely monitored by the FDA as well as by the Israeli medical society. But all viruses can cause myocarditis or heart inflammation. And one of the viruses that apparently seems to do a quote unquote really good job of causing myocarditis happens to be this one we're talking about, COVID-19. So the concern is not just from the vaccine of a young person getting a heart inflammation or a myocarditis, but it can also happen from the disease. And yes, we have seen young people, even children, with complications. We have seen very young children with serious complications as to this. 18-year-olds need to get the vaccine. Younger people need to get the vaccine because they can develop serious complications. They also, even more than the acute serious complications, can develop what we call long hauler syndromes, or the people who are just not as sharp as they were before they had the vaccine, memory loss issues. We need to make sure that we're getting that vaccine into younger people so that they don't have the complications. But even more than that, one of the reasons we give out flu shots to little people, is not because we're so worried about their complications, although they can have complications, especially in the under 2-year-old set, but because they are great transmitters of disease. The people who bring COVID home and then infect lots of other people happen to be the younger generation, who are less likely to mask, less likely to social distance, and more likely to share. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that answered that clear and straight on and head on. Dr. Oppenheim, can I ask you, we have somebody that says, how do we know there's long-term safety when it's just out for a short period of time?
So I think, the playing field today, when we're now many, many months into the vaccination, is very different than if you had asked this question in January or February, a month after the vaccine came out. We are now talking about hundreds of millions of doses that are given worldwide. And the complications are being monitored so closely through the post-market surveillance. And just I think one example of that, and this may sound paradoxical, but to me, the issue that you probably all heard about with the J&J vaccine being put on hold while investigating unusual types of blood clots in some patients, to me is actually the biggest sign of vaccine surveillance success. Because what you had was 1 million doses of something that was given all over the country, and 6 completely unrelated cases in different parts of the country being identified and pooled and noted by the regulatory authorities within a very short time frame. I don't think that would have happened almost with any other vaccine where 6 complications. When we saw other vaccine complications from, in early stages like the rotavirus problems we had, it took a while to piece it all together and find all the cases. Here, the surveillance is so tight. So now here we are, 7 months from vaccination. And when 6 cases out of 1 million occur in disparate parts of the country, the FDA knew about it and put a hold on the vaccine to figure out what was going on. So I think we can have a lot of confidence that the post-marketing surveillance in only 6 months may be equivalent to what we get with 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years where the vaccines get less surveillance. The other thing I'll say from a biologic and scientific perspective is that when we see vaccine complications, so there's something called Guillain-Barré that you can get after flu, or again, to use the rotavirus example, the intussusception, most of these tend to occur within the first few weeks or months after vaccination, because the material that gets administered to your body is eliminated from your body through the immunity that you induce. It's not there anymore to cause damage. So if it's going to do something, in general, it's going to do it within the first couple of months. Again, the only exception may be certain rare kinds of autoimmune diseases, which when your body's sort of primed to attack itself, and maybe this sort of non-specifically stimulates your immune system, you can maybe come up with a hypothesis, and it's purely a hypothesis, that something could happen later on. But the reality is when we see vaccine complications and almost every other vaccination where we've seen complications, it is within the first few weeks or by months. And shortly after, a couple of weeks after the vaccine is in you, any remnant of the material that was introduced is completely gone and can no longer really stimulate a reaction. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to be confident. Of course, we all have to be humble. We understand that we don't run the universe. Kadosh Baruch Hu runs the universe. We don't know everything. But based on every precedent with every other vaccine, there has not been issues that have occurred 6, 8, 12 months later that were completely unanticipated.
Thank you so much. As a follow-up question to that, are we concerned about the fact that that there isn't liability to the manufacturers?
So I will leave that. Was that for me?
Yes, it seemed to follow what you were saying about complications.
Again, I don't think I've never been relying on the ethics of the vaccine or pharmaceutical industry to make this safe, right? I'm relying on the governmental agencies and the vaccine, the VAERS reporting system, and I dare say that probably Dr. Dean Stagg is reporting to this. There is a system that every physician independently knows that they are required to report. As I said, even things that may not be vaccine complications, but if it happens after vaccine, it has to be reported, and an independent blinded panel of experts from the major leading medical regulatory agencies review it. So personally, I don't really care whether or not the vaccine companies are ethical, they're not ethical, they have perverse incentives or not. We don't have the fox watching the hen houses here. We have independent agencies that are driven by science who are looking at the vaccine efficacy and the vaccine safety.
Thank you. Dr. Altman, there's a question related to irregular menstrual cycle. One person comments, my concern about the vaccine is about the persistence of bleeding. Do you see this? And how would you advise a religious woman as that relates to Hilchos Taharas HaMishpacha?
So
I actually have seen very few patients complain about irregular bleeding from the vaccine. There has been, I actually go there, I have looked, there has been no formal studies yet that have come out about the irregular bleeding with the vaccine. So it is rare. It's like anything. Some patients get the irregular bleeding, majority do not. And it should not be persistent. So for us as obstetrician gynecologists, if you're a young person and have irregular bleeding for a month or two, it's not very concerning. If it's the third month that it's having irregular bleeding, it's highly unlikely it's from the vaccine, and that should be looked into, and you should see your gynecologist. In terms of guidelines, in terms of Taharat Mishpacha, I mean, I personally have not really I have a very large gynecological practice, and I have not had any patients really come in complaining that the bleeding was significant and troublesome. So, there are some reports about it. There have been no formal studies that have come out from it. And like everything, some patients have breakthrough bleeding on birth control pills. Majority do not. It's the same thing. Everybody is different and everybody responds differently. So, that's the most, there's been no formal data about this irregular bleeding that has yet to come out. But I certainly have not seen a high incidence of it in my practice.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Flem, I'm wondering if you would be comfortable to just address the concern. Is this a reason for a woman not to take the vaccine?
Talking about because of Taharat Mishpacha problems.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, according to our gynecologist obstetrician, the causation has never been proven to be there. So unless they can show there is actual causation between taking this specific vaccine and causing irregular blood flow, unless you can prove that, we are not worried about that. And according to Dr. Altman, we haven't proven that type of connection. Am I correct, Dr. Altman?
Right. There has been no formal connection with the two.
And if in fact it will in the future present itself as a definitive fact, we will then reevaluate what to do and how to deal with it. And where there is a will, there's always a halachic way of dealing with problems. So the fact of the matter is, until there is a definitive proof there is a problem and a connection, we're not going to worry and make problems that don't exist at this point in time.
But as a side note, should you not get the vaccine and should you get COVID, then you have to quarantine and you can't go to mikveh either. That's another thing to think about.
Excellent point.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Oppenheim, how long do antibodies from natural immunity last?
That is an excellent question. And unless we were going to continue the panel till midnight, we probably couldn't review all the information. I think there's a second unasked question that I'll throw out before I respond to it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the beauty of the vaccine technology that we're using is that we stimulate not only antibodies, which are one part of the immune system, but also something called T cells and memory B cells and all sorts of other parts of the immune system that are involved in the your body's fight against COVID. But I'll make a couple of general comments. So number one, the antibodies after natural infection have been shown to wane, and it varies widely depending on the severity of illness. They can be as little as 3 months to as long as, we're only a year out, and we know some people still have antibodies a year later. It remains an open question if the antibodies that we measure are truly a sign of protection. And this is an important point, and we may be going to a little bit of a rabbit hole, so I apologize. We measure a certain antibody, the spike protein antibody, or we used to measure something called the nucleocapsid, a different antibody, because it was a convenient and easy way for a laboratory to measure the presence of antibody. It is not necessarily proven, although there's some data to suggest that that is the antibody that actually fights off the virus. When your body is fighting any foreign invader, you make hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of antibodies against different parts of the invader to try to stop it. And we don't know exactly which are the most critical antibodies, other than when we do the vaccine trials. So when the vaccine trials were done, they did not measure the antibody that you would get from Quest or LabCorp or any doctor's office, or of course the Northwell Core Lab. What they measure is literally taking your blood in a tube with virus and cells on it and show your blood's ability to block the virus from entering those cells, right? It's what's called in the literature neutralizing antibody. So I give you that as a background because the answer is that the antibodies we can measure seem to last between 3 years and 3 months and at least a year. That's the longest we have to look at. Or now we have maybe 14, 15 months of data. Whether that really does or doesn't correlate with immunity is still an open question. So what we are relying on more is in the vaccine trials, we know that it produces this neutralizing antibody, right? Because they literally measure whether your blood can attack and stop this virus from invading a cell. And the clinical trial participants and now post-marketing are being followed over long periods of time for clinical disease. So the duration of protection from antibodies or the vaccine will only be determined not by measuring a blood test, but by following the clinical trial participants or patients who've had COVID before, or patients who've received the vaccine outside the trial, and seeing at what point do the neutralizing antibodies in their blood start to wane, and or at what point do we see the cases beginning to occur, right? And that is where this whole question of when we may need boosters or otherwise. But again, the best test of it is really going to be following clinical cases, because we know that, as I mentioned before, antibodies are only one piece of your immune response. So again, we can measure those neutralizing antibodies. We can test your blood's ability to stop the virus from entering a cell. But even that may wane over time, and your body still has protection because of what we call these memory cells that will sort of reinvigorate your immune system when exposed, or the T cells, which are much, much harder to measure routinely. So it's a very, very unknown question, but a lot of attention is being paid to following trial participants and vaccine recipients to understand the duration of protection.
Thank you. Dr. Dienstag, some doctors have stated that vaccinated people have an increased risk of infection for non-vaccinated people because they're shedding viral particles. Is that true?
It's absolutely not true, because there are no viral particles in the vaccine that we're giving people. There are very, very few vaccines that actually can do that, that can give somebody a virus. The only vaccine, and Dr. Oppenheim could correct me, the only vaccine that I remember clearly from many years ago was something called the oral polio vaccine, which we gave to babies and, cut out a few shots, but you could actually, the baby was actually producing some amount of viral particles, not dangerous to a healthy baby. However, there were issues that in the diaper, there were viral particles that could have infected people with immune deficiencies, particularly an immune deficiency now called HIV, which at that time was called AIDS. And it was pulled off the market for that reason. But the vaccine that we are giving now for the SARS-CoV vaccine actually only codes for a little piece of the protein of the virus, actually the leg, and it cannot possibly cause any disease or any virus to anyone. Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. It has come up fairly frequently in my practice.
I have to thank the participants. We don't get to see them, but we appreciate those who took the time to send in their real concerns so that we can hear the experts respond to them. So thank you, Dr. Dienstag. Rabbi Flaum, there's some question about hearing both sides, or there are people who diminish the risk of the vaccine, but increase the claim of the risk of the virus, as opposed to those who minimize the risk of the virus and increase the risk of the vaccine. When there's this sort of conflict of interest, or you're hearing both sides, there's some sense that we should be listening to the people who have no conflict of interest, as opposed to the industry of medicine, or the people who are getting funded by the government to do these studies, because they're somehow compromised or have some conflict in presenting the truth. Can you speak to trusting or not trusting the source of that information?
I want to make a very definitive statement, and I hope everybody in the audience is listening very carefully. Unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately, we have a great internet today in which a person could publicize information, send it out to millions of people around the world, and people who hear this and see this, not knowing whether it has any efficacy or not, will take it as Torah from Sinai and therefore base their decisions accordingly. From all the reports and medical journals that I have read, I do read medical journals, believe it or not, besides learning a block tomorrow. From all the stuff that I've read, I will tell you that there is no question on the face of this earth that every gadol b'Torah, every halachic medical ethicist like myself, and I'm talking about gedolim who are much older than me, who basically have a worldwide reputation. There's nobody that I know of repute, that's an expert in medicine halacha, that questions the efficacy of this specific vaccine, the halachic requirement to take the vaccine to prevent this terrible disease from literally potentially taking your life, and the importance of this vaccine to prevent it from allowing you to spread the disease to other people who might be more vulnerable. There is no gadol hadar who's an expert in medicine halacha that has put any prohibition or suffix or doubt in anybody's mind of the halachic responsibility to take this vaccine to literally prevent the spread of disease, and likewise to cause open herd immunity, as was mentioned by Dr. Dean said before. And I'm saying this without a question whatsoever. I know every one of the gedolim of the generation who deal with medicine halacha on a very intimate level. I've spoken to many of them. I've read much of their literature, and I've done my own personal research on this topic as well. And I lecture to my students who are medical students in the colleges that I teach, specifically in this case, Dura College, London College for Women. Initially, I used to lecture in Stern College for Yeshiva University. I can tell you very honestly that when it comes to this specific vaccine, to say it has 90 to 95% validity when it comes to preventing this disease is unheard of when it comes to vaccines that was mentioned before by Dr. Oppenheim. We're dealing with a very incredible refuah b'duka over here. And the fact of the matter is, and this is the fact of the matter, you are mechuyev according to Torah law to listen to the expert doctors of your generation when it comes to medical care. You just can't just read what it says on the internet. You have to speak to the experts who are known to be experts. And you have to speak to the halachas that are known to be halachic experts in medicine halacha. The normal smicha you get in a yeshiva does not make you an expert in medicine and halacha. And unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately, when it came to the anti-vacciners of a couple of years ago, anybody who promulgated an opinion that taking a vaccine, for no matter what you're taking it for, you're endangering your life, and according to Allah, you should not do such, had no expertise whatsoever in medicine and halacha. And it was countered by all the Gedolei Hadar that were experts in medicine and halacha. And that's why I quoted you, Rav Cutler. Rav Cutler, in order to show people that polio shots were important and you're mechuyev to take it because Arapi, he rolled up his sleeve publicly and demonstrated that specific point. In Jewish history, I can tell you over and over again, the famous story of Israel Salant, in his generation, there was a problem of cholera. And when it came to Yom Kippur, he was told by the doctors that if they fast, they're going to put themselves in terrible endangerment. They're going to put themselves, because of their weakness, of being susceptible. What did Israel Salant do? On the night of Kol Nidre, on the beginning of Yom Kippur, he went in front of his congregation and he said to them, I want you to know this Yom Kippur, we are not going to fast because of the potential pekuach nefesh or safek pekuach nefesh. He then raised a cup of wine and he made kiddush, and he drank it to show them that he is not fasting because of what the doctors told him is needed to protect him from disease, and therefore his congregants shouldn't be more religious than he is. This is the halacha of pekuach nefesh being dochel kol ha'tarei, safek even svek is a dochel kol ha'tarei. So whoever thinks they're smarter than the doctors and smarter than the halachas who have studied this topic and can promulgate to people that it's a bigger danger to take the vaccine than not to take the vaccine has no idea what medicine halacha is all about. And I don't even want to have abilities for them to even debate me. If they want to debate me, I won't even bother debating them. The statistics and the facts prove the point I just mentioned to you. And that is the consensus of 99.999% of the Gedolim who are experts in this specific area.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Oppenheim, one of our participants says, I don't need to take the vaccine because there are other COVID preventions out there that are more effective than the vaccine. For example, ivermectin or hydrochloroquine. Is that true?
Halavai. So we talk about both. Let's talk about hydroxychloroquine first, because that is far more studied than the ivermectin, which I'll talk about in a moment. But hydroxychloroquine has absolutely been shown in study after study after study to have no influence either in active COVID disease, as it was originally studied, as well as in the prevention. Probably the largest and best study was done right here in the city in Columbia. And it showed that patients who were receiving hydroxychloroquine did not get COVID with a lower incidence than those who are not taking hydroxychloroquine. So no disrespect to our past president, it is not an effective prophylactic measure. Ivermectin is still an evolving story, but as of today, there is no data that really shows that ivermectin prevents COVID. Just for those who are not familiar, ivermectin is a very commonly used antiparasitic drug. And in test tube studies like hydroxychloroquine, it looked like it could prevent the virus from replicating, which again, is a big leap from what you show in a test tube to what happens in the human body, right? That was what happened with hydroxychloroquine. People said, hey, in the test tube, excuse me, it inhibits the virus. It turned out to do nothing in the human body. So ivermectin is the same story. The reason people are looking and wondering whether it has some prophylactic protection is purely based on some large population studies that said, hey, here are countries with high parasitic burden, a lot of people getting parasite disease, and a lot of ivermectin being used. And look, they have a slightly lower incidence of COVID than other countries. Now, obviously, that, we say in statistics all the time, association does not prove causality. Right? So there may be other factors in those countries that are leading to it. It may be less densely populated, more rural. There are a lot of reasons why those countries may have lower incidence. And simply by saying, well, they happen to have lots of ivermectin used and they happen to have less COVID does not prove that the ivermectin is preventing COVID. So right now, there is no data that ivermectin is an effective preventive. The only thing that we have that shows any clinical benefit is among multiple studies. There was one study in patients in the ICU with ivermectin that you had a slight percentage better survival, just a handful of percent, nothing significant. And again, in the early hydroxychloroquine trials, which were very small, we saw the same thing. And then when larger trials were pooled, we didn't see it. So it is certainly worthy of study because any port in a storm when it comes to this disease. But at this point, there is no way that we can say, if you take ivermectin, you are protected. There is no reliable study data that bears that out.
Thank you. Before we run out of time, Dr. Altman, while the question says doctors have said that there's no reason to believe that the vaccine will affect fertility, but that's quite different than seeing its effect after a few years and knowing that for certain. I am hesitant to have my teenage daughter take it, especially since the virus doesn't affect them so strongly. Can you speak to fertility and the concern of information over time?
I'm not a fertility specialist, but fertility, Dr. Oppenheim could answer to this. I'm not really sure how the vaccine could affect somebody's fertility. It's, fertility, a woman's infertile, either because she doesn't get her periods regularly and the vaccine does not cause that, or her tubes are blocked and the vaccine doesn't cause that, or the sperm count, a man's sperm count. I can't answer to men because I don't take care of men, but certainly in terms of a female, I'm not really sure how this publicity and why this concern came up, that this vaccine could affect fertility. We have vaccines. We actually, before somebody gets pregnant, we make sure they're up to date with all their vaccines. Because if you get some of the, like German measles, if you get German measles when you're pregnant, it will cause congenital anomalies of the fetus. So I'm not really sure why, I don't know if it's a social media, why there has been so much concern about fertility and the vaccine. It boggles all of us, because we are a little confused why they think this vaccine will cause problems with fertility. Maybe Dr. Oppenheim could answer me in terms of the science behind it, that this has come up, that people are so concerned.
So Lenise Dati, it's not based on science. There was a person who promulgated a theory based on absolutely nothing, where they said, oh, there's a protein in the uterus that resembles the spike protein of the virus, and if you make antibodies to the spike protein of the virus, you'll attack your uterus. It was completely made up, but it ripped through the internet, and it really doesn't even pass the sniff test from a reality perspective, because when you get natural COVID infection, you make the same antibodies that your body is being trained to make with the vaccine. And so if this were true, that antibodies against spike protein attack your uterus, women who had natural COVID should be having inflammation of the uterus and infertility. And again, Dr. Altman, I don't want to step on your toes, but I do not think there's any literature that says there's any fertility issues in post-COVID women. And as a matter of fact, the scientists at Yale studied this in cell culture. They published an article, an editorial in the New York Times. If you Google COVID uterus infertility, it'll come up from the New York Times, where they took cells from the uterus and they exposed it to serum from patients who had COVID vaccination or natural COVID infection. There was no reaction whatsoever.
Thank you so much. If I can, just one more. Is it true that thousands of people have died from taking the vaccine?
So I think I too get those robocalls on my phone telling me about the thousands of people that have died from the COVID vaccine. That is incorrect. What you will find on the CDC website is that the VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is, as I said before, every physician is required to report any complications or any even potential complications to the government through this VAERS system. In the VAERS system, there are 4,863 reports of people who died in chronologic proximity to the vaccine. Now, that includes elderly nursing home patients with multiple chronic illnesses. And even if, by the way, so even if that were true, relative to the number of vaccine doses given, that's a 0.0017% death rate. Although I think Rabbi Flaum would argue that from a Pekuach Nefesh perspective, we'd be choishish for a 0.002%. But the fact is, what they say, and you can find this on the CDC website, after review of the information by an individual panel, no causal link to the vaccine was established. Again, these have to be reported because by law, if something untoward happens in proximity to the vaccine, you must report it. In the investigation after, when they look at the cases, none of them were felt to be linked to the vaccine. And that is where that robocall we all get, 4,000 people died, that's where they're coming. They're reading that 4,000 were reported to VAERS, none of them were determined to be associated with the vaccine, and we can, promulgate the link to the CDC website. I see Rabbi Flaum's trying to get a word in.
I just want to add one point to what Dr. Altman said before. I have spoken to a good number of fertility specialists who are doctors in the field, And what they said to me, and I want people to hear this clearly, the most dangerous situation a person can be in when it comes to being susceptible to the disease and perhaps even dying from the disease is to be a pregnant woman who was never, ever subject to getting inoculation from this specific disease. Supposedly, according to the medical reports, they are the most susceptible for danger taking place because they're pregnant with babies and do not have any antibodies. And there are more deaths in that camp than women, than quite obviously who were vaccinated and Baruch Hashem tolerated and they're okay. They are surely, when it comes to statistics, there aren't too many statistics indicating any danger to the mother or the baby. On the contrary, they're protected, they're both protected, as was mentioned about the mother passing over through her milk and other stuff to the baby. The best thing you could say for a woman is if you want your daughter to be protected and her baby to be protected, let them undergo this specific vaccine now when they're still not even married yet or before they get pregnant. That's the greatest way of preventing them from getting any sickness and having the children have any ramifications. This I heard from fertility experts.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Dr. Oppenheim, if I can you just explain how the DNA vaccine does or doesn't change one's DNA?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, we're mimicking to a certain extent what happens with a virus infection, right? Viruses do not have the ability to integrate and take over your own genome. That's why when you get a cold virus, you don't wind up with cold virus genes in your DNA. Similarly, flu, you name it, with one or two very unique exceptions, viruses don't have the material necessary, the enzymes that would be required to insert their DNA into your DNA. They sit in the cytosol or maybe in the nucleus separate from your genes. And then again, they get killed off, as we mentioned, when your immune system reacts. So just like a natural virus bringing itself into your cells to take over your cellular machinery to manufacture more virus, these proteins, again, not virus that are coming in, do not integrate in your DNA any more or less than the cold virus, the flu virus, the stomach flus, you name it.
Thank you. And thank you to our panelists. I think somebody said earlier, we can have this conversation to midnight, but that wouldn't be fair to our participants. For those of you who did not get your questions asked, for those of you who asked questions but didn't get your answers or will have questions following this event, please feel free to send them to VaxFacts, that's VaxFacts at JOWMA, JOWMA.org. And lastly, if I can ask you to please take the survey. You can scan the QR codes now on your screen, or you can go to the VaxFacts website to find it, or click the forms button to click. We really would like to hear what you thought about this event, and you have a chance to win a $50 Amazon gift card. So take the minute to let us know how it was, and hopefully one of you lucky people will win that gift card. Again, we thank JOWMA, Beaker Cholim, Hatzalah, and the JCCRP for sponsoring this event for the community, and to each of our experts, Rabbi Flaum, Dr. Oppenheim, Dr. Dienstag, and Dr. Altman. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us tonight.